Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap today, as always, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, just know you will be able to access it on demand. We will be sending out a link later on today that includes a link to the webinar on demand, so you will be able to access it at your convenience. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time today during our presentation you have a question for any of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will take as many as we can during today's webinar. Okay, with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce today's webinar, which is Global DevOps. DevOps takes on the world. Our panelists today, we have a lineup of panelists, and I can't tell, Brian, can you tell me if everybody is on screen? I'm not seeing, okay, so if we can get our panelists to go ahead and load up your webcam here, and we'll go ahead and introduce all of our panelists. While that's happening, our first panelist is Colin Dominy, who is a DevOps consultant at Veracode, and he unfortunately is not going to be able to join us on camera, but Colin, welcome. Our next panelist, you're welcome. Our next panelist is Shiri Ifsan, who is product manager at WhiteSource. Shiri, welcome to today's webinar.
Hi.
Our next panelist is Eric Koslow, who is Developer Relations at Contrast Security. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Great. And then our final panelist today is David McKay, who is a Developer Advocate at Influx Data. Hi, David. Thanks for joining me.
Hi there.
So I'd actually like to kick off today's webinar by having each of you just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and your company. And Colin, why don't we go ahead and start with you?
Thanks very much. So my name's Colin Dominy. I'm a former application security specialist. I built an AppSec program at one of the big investment banks. I worked for Veracode. I'm a DevSecOps consultant. I help big organizations, global organizations, really do their DevOps and more importantly, DevSecOps on a really global and very large scale.
Okay, great. Thanks. Shiri.
I'm Shiri. I'm a product manager at WhiteSource. And at WhiteSource, what we do is open source management. So we deal with all the different aspects of open source, from quality aspects, security, licensing. So typically people think that open source, it's a great idea. We see the adoption, but there are also some challenges. So we try to help companies deal with the challenges and develop better using open source code securely.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shiri. Eric.
Sounds great. I'm Eric Koslow. I'm a member of the Contrast Security team. We focus on making applications self-defending or getting applications to find their own vulnerabilities since the application knows what it does. Before joining Contrast, I was the principal product manager of Java 8 for Oracle. If anyone remembers back when it had all of its security vulnerabilities, I helped step up and secure the JRE.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Eric. And then finally, David.
Hi, I'm a developer advocate at Influx Data. Influx Data is a San Francisco-based company that builds an open source time series database. Prior to that, I was an SRE and system administrator. All
right. Great. Great. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about today's webinar. It's going to be based partly on the latest ebook that we've put out through DevOps.com. It is called Global DevOps, literally a changing world. And everybody who has registered for today's webinar will be receiving a link to download the ebook. It should be later on today, but it's also available on DevOps.com. So take a look for it. Okay, so I guess probably the first way we want to, or the first thing that we want to talk about when we're talking about global DevOps is really what it means. I think it's probably best, most important to kind of set that stage. So I kind of want to throw it out to you guys. Maybe Sherry, maybe you want to take this one. When we're talking about global DevOps, what do you think it means specifically, and what does it mean for companies?
Yeah, so DevOps is for development operations, as we all know. And the idea is really to have the enterprise software development phase be a lot more agile and a lot more fast. Now, if we think about global organizations or enterprises, large customers, large companies, we can clearly see the friction here, right? We can see that on the one hand, you want to implement like this agile thing, you want to have development happening a lot faster. Like a main idea of DevOps in general is the communication, right? The communication, the collaboration between different teams, between different units. And that is something that if we bring it to a global scale, it's a challenge anyway. So that's what I think about when I think of global DevOps. And I guess that throughout this webinar, we're going to discuss some of the challenges and how to overcome them.
Okay, great. Because the concept of global DevOps, I know, means different things to different people, and it can be kind of a muddy topic. So it's interesting to get people's perspective on what they think when they hear global DevOps. Eric, what do you think when you think of global DevOps? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so like Sherry just said, it literally means developers and operations just working together. But global, of course, means you have to scale across different regions, either within a public cloud or going multi-cloud to just engage whichever one is maybe more prominent in your particular country. For example, China likes Alibaba Cloud a little more than the US, which is focused on AWS and Azure. And so what we get is developer and operations teams are not necessarily replacing each other, like development doesn't take over operations. What you get is operations managing the environment, networking, VMs, host provisioning, the bare metal, and the development teams can just focus on the choices of what they need to run their own applications and then get them up and operating properly in an environment.
All right. That's a lot to consider there. David, what about you? What do you, when you're thinking about global DevOps, what does it mean to you?
So I won't repeat everything else that's been said because Eric and Sherry are perfect there. I think that handles the functional aspects of global DevOps, as in taking an application and your infrastructure, scaling that around the globe. But I'm also keen that we don't forget the cultural aspect of DevOps. You have to consider that your team is going to be distributed as well as your application. So handling the processes, the techniques, project management, all of that has to really adapt as well when you want to scale DevOps globally.
Okay, great. Colin, I'm sure everything that's been said you're going to be in total agreement with. But do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think I've seen this firsthand. I mean, I'm currently sat in a hotel in Germany, working with an Asian OEM manufacturer for a German company, and representing Veracode in Boston, right? So I've kind of I've seen DevOps programs. Yeah, this is the world we're in now. We're going to talk about the cloud later. The cloud brings benefits of, infrastructure can just be spun up anywhere around the world at a click of a button. And organizations that really adopt DevOps globally can use the benefits of being able to arbitrage costs to be able to find, the most skilled developers in the regions most suitable to them. So I think there's a lot of benefits, and of course, my time in investment banking, that's a global organization, and I've seen how they've how organizations can do this on scale.
Excellent. Actually, you're a perfect segue to my next question, which was really what are some of those benefits that companies can achieve or realize? So do you want to go ahead and tackle that?
Again. Yeah, I'll just finish that sentence. Sure. Really, I think so. One of the things we're talking about costs. People can do clever things where they can play the time zone. They can be a 24-hour development shop. They can spin it across regions. Let's pick those cost ones. The culture. We'll talk about culture. That becomes difficult to manage. But of course, with DevOps, if everything is running as code, the cultures and the languages become a little bit less of an issue. So I'll just throw those out there as some of the benefits. I'll let others pick up on that.
Great. Who wants to go next? Who wants to talk about the benefits?
Yeah, so the benefit that we would get regularly with Turbonomic, which helped organizations migrate their on-premise workloads up to the cloud, was typically the ability to burst on capacity and take advantage of all the cloud resources, and somewhat to manage their costs, even though people regularly pay about 3 times what they would have expected. So sometimes they would migrate their workloads up, and then other times they would migrate their workloads back down, just due to predictive costs.
Okay, great. David or Shuri, do you guys have any other benefits that you can think about?
Yeah, so one other thing would be, of course, like if we deal with DevOps and cloud is frequent releases, right? We can deliver value to our customers more frequently, especially when dealing with the cloud with global teams. In addition, there's a lot of emphasis on automation, and that becomes a lot easier when you have a global team. So you don't have to, there's no time, the time differences matter less because you don't have to manually work with the teams, right? You have to, but automation is really the key to success here. So I think these are some of the great benefits that come with global DevOps.
Okay. David, anything to add?
Yeah, I had a couple of things. I think the global distribution of our application is really important. You know, if you're lucky enough to be in the US or in like mainland Europe, your application will be really fast because a lot of companies host their applications there. When you start to talk to your customers that are in Asia or Australia, you usually find that their latency is a lot higher. So by adopting a global rollout strategy, pushing that code closer to your customers, you're going to reduce that latency and improve the experience for them. And of course, from the workforce aspect, being able to hire anywhere in the world, so you're hiring the people that are right for the job rather than those that best fit the skills within a really small distribution circle is a huge benefit. And of course, from an SRE perspective, round-the-clock coverage, making sure your workers aren't overworked, making sure people are, their on-call schedule is hopefully within their working hours. There are many benefits to the global DevOps strategy.
All right, cool, excellent. Well, obviously, because global DevOps is different from possibly regular DevOps or just in-country DevOps. So, are there particular process or issues with technologies or processes that global DevOps kind of brings to light that maybe companies wouldn't be as attuned to not taking their DevOps global? That makes sense. Shuri, why don't we start with you?
So I think mostly like when you work globally, everything has to be communicated better. So if we think about DevOps, the DevOps promise is like self-service deployment, driven by development on demand. And if we think about global organization, that might be a little bit of a challenge, right? Because we think of approval gates, we need processes in place. So we need to sort of think of how we combine these two together. So we have like a lot of processes like change control. So there is a change control process for releases. If we work globally, there are massive environments, right? There might be a lot more environments that you have to consider. So the orchestration and the management may be a lot complex when working like globally in the cloud rather than just what we call regular or in-country DevOps.
Okay, great. Colin, what about you? Are there any certain processes or technologies or something that we really need to be considerate of when we're talking about global DevOps?
Yeah, so I think a good example that I can bring to mind here is running a program using Veracode. Now, Veracode is scanning your code, finding flaws in your code. Now, that conversation that you end up having with different teams, it's very nuanced. It's different cultures. Certain cultures don't take, don't respond well to criticism. They take it personally. Other cultures, other regions will see it more as it's just business. So you might be using a global tool and you might have automated everything, but you still have to be sensitive to the way that developers or in the particular regions are going to perceive, what the machine is telling them. So I think it's just being mindful of that.
Good point. Good point. David, what about you? Any thoughts there?
So I think one of the main differentiators for me is when you start to look at some of the laws. If you take Europe as an example, we've got GDPR, which is very strict regulations on the way that companies store and manage their data and interact with their customers, especially for subject access requests. So when you take your application to a global scale, you really need to work out how are we going to handle the sharding of that data? How do we make sure it's still fast for people around the world, depending on where that data lives? And there are a lot of considerations that really have to come into place. And of course, you have to rely on a lot more automation than you typically would, especially as your team grows around the world as well, and that you don't want to have deployments or any processes that are reliant on someone within a specific time zone. So enforcing more automation and handling your data sharding is critical.
Interesting. All right. Hadn't thought about that, actually. Eric, what about you? Do you have any thoughts there regarding the global DevOps?
Yeah, so in terms of global DevOps, the DevOps piece is still there, so there's not a lot different there. Otherwise, availabilities and SLAs, which we covered. But I like David's response on compute regions and availability for the way that workloads are tagged, because if we want to take a workload and move it across different clouds and optimize its performance or cost, there are certain things that we can't migrate between different regions. So we can't take things from the EU, where Colin is right now, that processes data in GDPR, and move it outside of the EU to someplace that's maybe a more optimal cost or has a lower latency. So we need ways of being able to tag these things so that the automation systems that operate for DevOps can actually figure it out and, number one, do the right thing, but just as importantly, not do the wrong thing.
All right. Excellent. All right, guys. So one of the things that I think that has really kind of spurred global DevOps and just DevOps in general, actually, is the cloud. I mean, it's kind of like the great, the great technology that's enabled so much enabled everybody to do so much. So I'm really curious as to where you guys see the cloud's role in global DevOps, and is it really any different than in the regular DevOps? And what are any insight there you could provide would be great, because I'm wondering if there's something different with the cloud in global DevOps that maybe we don't necessarily consider with regular DevOps. And Eric, why don't you start us off with this one?
Sure. The main thing that the cloud provides is just a series of resources that are available there for bursting horizontal capacity based on demand. So it doesn't really reduce the need for any development or operations, but what it does is give them the ability to scale just ad nauseum to based on whatever they need, and also do that without human intervention. So there's no more need to file a scan request or get some guidance from an expert to get your kind of strobe light accessibility to resources or anything. So you get full-time optimization of cost and performance and things. And developers also get the ability to choose services that are available in each cloud, like AWS or Azure or Pivotal, not just the bare metal resources of requesting a machine from an operations person that gets deployed in a data center. So now you have advantage of the services from a cloud provider as well.
Colin, what about choice of cloud provider or something like that? Is that certainly a consideration when we're talking about global DevOps?
Yeah, I think possibly. I think people have to be mindful. I think one of the common questions that I'll get asked is, how do I avoid lock-in? How do I arbitrage one vendor against the other? I think probably from the global slant on these things. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're going to be wanting to be able to scale on a truly global scale, you need to be picking a provider that's got you that global coverage. And, there's more than one of these. So I think those would be the considerations is, be clever with your strategy of being able to arbitrage one vendor out against the other, and just be mindful of the lock-in. Some customers that I know are very happy with that. They have a strategic partnership with a particular vendor, and it's often a mutually beneficial relationship. If you're not in that fortunate position, then just be mindful of choosing your cloud provider.
Okay. Sherry, along those lines, certain cloud providers can't actually work in other regions of the world, and they just don't have, that quote unquote global reach. So what are some best practices there, if you can kind of maybe lay out a couple things that maybe folks need to keep in mind when they're thinking about which cloud provider they decide to go with?
Yeah, so I think the decision is really important. I mean, as we mentioned here, lock-in is a real challenge, and we see a lot of companies choosing one cloud provider, and the migration is really hard once you decide on one. So I think that the decision point is very important. We do see a lot of companies going to the idea of multi-cloud. So having part of the resources in one public cloud, others in another public cloud, and maybe some of the resources in a private cloud. So it's really a matter of the specific organization and the needs. And there are a lot of, consultants or companies that can help with the decision. But I think it needs to be properly considered. If we think in general, so cloud and global DevOps, they go hand in hand. So you can do one without the other, but they're really much stronger together once they are applied together. So I think we have the cloud first is now broadly accepted among organizations. I guess the DevOps idea is also starting to be very popular among larger organizations as well.
All right, great. David, what do you think, when we're talking about the cloud providers, are there any other considerations maybe that we haven't gone over? I'm thinking about maybe just the maybe any compliance or anything like that, issues that they might run into. Is there anything of that consideration-wise that folks need to be aware of?
So I think the cloud role is super important. I think everyone's already covered the main benefits, but I think what's really important here is that cloud has made infrastructure a commodity for developers. We've put APIs in front of virtual machines, in front of services, even in front of databases, in front of backups. So you can get really far as a startup company adopting cloud technologies with a team of only developers with no operations experience whatsoever, and that'll scale really well for a while. So I think cloud role is really turboing or speeding up. All of these new startups are going to see a lot more innovation happening there in the software field, because companies can now focus on building an app that is really killer rather than having to surround themselves with the tedious work of replacing disks and machines, spinning up new servers. And of course, for global reach, opening a new data center is an extremely expensive task. The last company I worked with spent hundreds of millions building and maintaining their data center, which lasted them for 5 years. If they had put even a portion of that cost towards public cloud, who knows where they would be today and how much extra dev they would have to make that product even better. So cloud is fundamental for me for global DevOps. I don't think you can probably do it, at least not with terrible expense if you try to do it without a public cloud.
Yeah. And
I'm supportive of OpenStack as well. Even if you're running your private cloud for a while, adopting OpenStack is going to ease that migration path as well. Again, APIs in front of your infrastructure is key here.
Okay, it seems like the cloud is kind of like the great democratizer, if you will, because it does really bring a lot of these to your point, David, these maybe developers in like small towns and in far-reaching countries that maybe have never really been on the radar of larger organizations, and then all of a sudden they're a player. They're right up there, and they're noticed as much as the larger organizations are, and it's all because of the cloud, because they have that reach. So yeah, I agree. I think the cloud is really probably the most important aspect to global DevOps, and I think it's a huge consideration for a lot of companies, and it's not one that's that it's a decision that they should take lightly. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next one, which is, security considerations. And I know this is the one that Sherry has been waiting for. So I'm gonna actually start with you, Sherry, on what are some of the security considerations when we're talking about implementing or even just considering global DevOps. What do folks need to really keep in mind?
So in WhiteSource, this is something that we see a lot. We see a lot of customers going from traditional infrastructure and traditional models of handling the application into DevOps. And one of the things that we see developers, DevOps specifically very challenged with is the security aspect, because I think that moving to the cloud makes them aware of all the security aspects. So I think that one of the considerations that we need to is, first of all, we need to be aware of the challenges or the barriers that we have. So sometimes when rolling DevOps, there is a cultural resistance to security. So there is this perception that security is going to slow the processes down, which is very problematic when you try to roll out DevOps for faster development, for faster delivery of the software. So what we believe in WhiteSource, and we usually help our customers do, is sort of bake the security into the pipeline. So we understand where the organization is currently at in terms of implementing DevOps, and then we try to fit in the security aspects. And I think the key here is really having the right processes in place. So as we think of like DevSecOps, we think about implementing security into the life cycle. So not having security as a separate process. So one example would be to when you research and you choose the component that you want to use, for example, an open source component, you can bake in the security at a very early stage. So there are a lot of open source security for DevOps, but also for developers, some open source applications, and the research phase is very important. So we try to highlight the security aspect along the way. Also, when the user actually writes the code, we highlight the security vulnerabilities or the security issues along the way. And I think these processes actually help introduce DevOps and security a lot easier to the organization internally.
All right. Eric, I'm interested in hearing what your organization is doing as far as like security especially when it comes to global DevOps. What are you hearing from your customers maybe if they're thinking about going global, so to speak, with their DevOps implementations? And are there certain things that stand out in your mind that they're?
Yeah, we definitely have some things that stand out. So with regards to custom software or software that people purchase or just acquire or get, a lot of the CVEs are available for those. So you can identify like what the CVEs are in those open source components. But a big question as people go and operate in cloud speed and do DevOps, pushing their own custom applications up there, is there a CVE for your custom application? Or maybe you've taken different open source libraries that are each secure on their own, and you've put them together in a way that's not. So the question for people who deploy at that speed is, how do you find your own vulnerabilities before they become a CVE, or before nobody reports them as a CVE and just uses them against you? So really, how do people find or stop those vulnerabilities when the code is custom or across the way that's otherwise secured libraries are put together? And when people are moving at this speed, like we've all talked about DevOps being faster, moving at the pace of business with a 24/7 operating cycle, at that pace, you can't really rely effectively on this type of strobe light scan visibility of taking the scan results that somebody did 2 weeks ago and applying it to today. So what we want, and what a lot of Contrast customers are looking for, is how do we get security into a continuous process whereby the applications are assessing themselves and either finding or protecting their own vulnerabilities. So what a lot of people go for is really two things, which is visibility to find the unknowns, so assessing your applications, and also protecting an application. So being able to adapt very quickly, have the applications defend themselves without human intervention or different development sprints, so that they can operate at that cloud pace and update their defenses as new attacks arise.
All right, lots to think about there. David, what about you, your company? You know, when you guys are talking to your customers, are there any sort of hot button security issues that they're thinking about when it comes to global DevOps?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, all the standard security things that we've done for the last 20 years apply. If you can get away with it running SSH in your production infrastructure, you should do that. You should always use TLS between intercommunicating services whenever possible, and of course TLS to any external customers. All of this carries right over to global DevOps, but you do have this kind of new attack surface potentially, and that the machines and virtual machines you use in your cloud provider are generally multi-tenant. So you have to keep that in mind. The cloud providers do their best to protect you, but it doesn't mean that you can't take extra steps to make sure that you're protected in case there is any reported vulnerability later on. So just all the standard DevOps practices apply. Think of the new attack surfaces and really just take it from there.
Excellent, excellent. Colin, the idea of keeping kind of security as you would with regular DevOps, taking it global, does that sit with you? I mean, is there maybe something more that we're not talking about here when it comes to security in your mind?
Yeah, I think to Eric's point about having the applications protecting themselves, I think as you go truly global and you do things at global scale, you need to be choosing a solution that is going to get you that scale. And that's normally, when I'm talking to folk about building out AppSec programs, that's normally the biggest blocker that I see. People have done a successful pilot, they put a tool in a particular region, but they don't know how to scale this out massively. And of course, the cloud and global DevOps allows you to reach kind of numbers of applications that we've never seen before. So I think that's probably the biggest problem is how do you cover your whole application estate? It's just the sheer scale of it.
Okay, all right. So, are there particular technologies, and I'm kind of throwing this out to whoever wants to answer, are there particular technologies that perhaps work better for global DevOps and when it comes to security? Or are there certain technologies that maybe should not be used when we're talking about global DevOps and security?
Well, so we talked about the notion of cross-cloud migrations earlier with AWS or Azure or people moving between them. And one of the things that I like to focus on is what's common between all these clouds, or what's a common point that we can secure, because if we could secure something that is shared everywhere, we can benefit everywhere. And the thing that's common amongst all of these is Java applications are still Java. Python applications are still Python. Node applications are still Node. So if we focus on securing the runtime within the application, we now have the ability to go anywhere across a different cloud or on-premise because we've secured a common point.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think another very important aspect when thinking about security and DevOps is the automation part. Because when we think about DevOps in general, we usually think automation, but we need to emphasize that on the security level as well. So if we do automation with our software deployment, we can also do automation for security. So automate the detection of the vulnerabilities. We just mentioned CVEs or the vulnerability databases, so you can identify if you have a known CVE versus your application. So this can be done automatically. One other thing that we usually do with customers is automate the prioritization. So not only based on the severity of the CVE, but also based on, so there is is this vulnerability actually effective? Meaning, I have this big open source project with many lines in it, many lines of code, but in my proprietary code, it actually only references very few methods. So what we do is we have a technology to actually identify what are the vulnerabilities, the open source vulnerabilities that are being called by your proprietary code. And this eliminates about 80% of the vulnerabilities that were there originally. So I think the automation really helps us deal with all the masses of, you know, security aspects that we have in the application.
All right, great. Anybody else have anything?
I'll just pick up something there. I think. Sorry, David, you go first.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about the automation that Sherry mentioned. You know, I think it's really important to have all of that automation, but make sure it's being reviewed as well. When people are making changes to your infrastructure, make sure there's a really simple pull request process there for people to go in and make sure that you've just not made a silly mistake that exposes your machines to the world. You know, pull request processes are really important. And the simplest thing you could do, you know, if you're moving to the cloud and you're fortunate enough to be deploying with containers, you know, simply adding the read-only flag to that container is going to remove 70% of your attack surface from, especially for web applications where the generic MO is upload a file to a temporary directory, have it write code to the root of the disk or modify a script. And you could eradicate an entire class of problems with one simple read-only flag on that container.
Awesome. All right. Colin?
Yeah, what I was going to say was I'm very optimistic about, we're talking about security tooling, that it works well in DevOps. I think DevOps gives security vendors an opportunity to reach an audience that they, you know, they haven't yet had. Right? If your tool integrates very well into a marketplace, if you can go to Azure DevOps and you can get the plugins and the connectivity to be able to just put the frictionlessly put a plugin or a tool into a pipeline, you know, that's how you're going to get you know, developers coming to the tool. So it's a chance to really do security better rather than having to have this cumbersome after the fact process where the security people come in and plug the tools in hindsight. So I think it's an advantage, and I think the vendors and the tools that play nicely in that space and understand that sort of paradigm shift, I think they're the ones that are going to succeed.
All right. Great. Well, doing a quick time check, we are about 24 minutes to the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is drawbacks to global DevOps. You know, do they exist? Are there any drawbacks at all to rolling out DevOps on a global scale? And I ask this question because nothing is perfect in this world, and so I think it's important that we show global DevOps warts and all. So I don't know who wants to start us off with this. You know, if there are any DevOps global DevOps drawbacks that we should be discussing.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of obvious ones that pop into my mind for sure. Cost. It's not going to be cheap, as your application has to be replicated geographically depending on the customer base that you want to target. And we also have to remember that our architectures of applications are changing rapidly. You know, in the last 5 years, there's this movement to being cloud native, microservice based, loads and loads of tiny small services. And it's not like you're scaling one application in 3 different geographic regions, but you're probably scaling 1,500 services 3 times in geographic regions. You know, so that is going to be a very expensive process if you want to roll that out. And of course, if we consider the data sharding with GDPR in Europe and US located data, you know, having global load balancers that know how to distribute that traffic and point it to the right place, there's a lot of tooling involved there, a lot of understanding, and a lot of problems you're going to get as you try and roll out that migration as well.
All right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would just say developers sometimes think that they have to own operations, which is not necessarily true. Work with an operations team. If you have somebody who likes doing ops, let them do it so that people can focus on what they're good at. And cost, as David said, is just huge.
Colin, any
I think
thoughts?
one thing I might think of is just be sensitive to the fact that you're going to have different people in different economies with different levels of sensitivity about their job security. And if suddenly you roll out a cloud solution with DevOps into a region, you know, that might really upset that workforce. So be thinking about what that rollout plan is going to look like in practice, because people will potentially feel threatened. So if you're going to do that, make sure you've got a plan to reskill or re-enable them to up their capabilities.
Okay, great. Sherry, any thoughts?
It's not really a drawback, but another challenge is the technology, I think. So, DevOps teams sometimes face challenges. While DevOps is more than, it's not its set of tools, but it's obvious that in order to establish real DevOps, you have to learn new tools and use new tools. Some of these tools used by DevOps are also open source. So we have, again, the open source adoption challenge. So I think this is another challenge with, the DevOps infrastructure and technology that you have to take into consideration while planning moving to global DevOps.
Okay. So earlier in the webcast, we also talked very briefly about culture. And I'm wondering if that's how high on the scale is it, if you will, as far as challenges or drawbacks are concerned? Do you guys see the challenge of working with different cultures, different parts of the world? Do you see that as a real challenge that companies will have to overcome, or is it something that's just, it's there, well, let's deal with it and move on?
I think it's a real challenge. I mean, we deal with it every day, every global company. Even if you're not a DevOps, you're a developer or a product manager, and you deal with different cultures globally, there's a challenge there. And I think with DevOps, there's even a bigger challenge because you have to have all these processes in place. You want to ship everything a lot faster. There is the technology challenge. So I think this is definitely something that you need to consider and you need to plan for it before while moving, and it's a challenge that we still deal with every day. I mean, it's not something that you solved it and it's over. It's something that you have to deal with over and over again.
All right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll chime in. I mean, that I've seen in practice is, I think the more we automate and we use infrastructure as code and we express ourselves in programming languages and get away from, manual verbose documents written in normally English as a first language, and then have somebody who's not an English native speaker having to read a change request or a deployment document, that's just fraught with danger, right? There's little subtle things in the way people will interpret the written word. If it's all automated and it's all code, the dangers of things going wrong there are less. So, the culture thing, definitely a consideration to understand how different people will respond, but I think the benefits probably do outweigh that.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have it as much of an issue. I just talk to everybody from wherever they are in the world, and I just try to be nice to everybody, and that seems to work pretty well.
So there's the rule then, just be nice.
Works for me.
I think the communication model has to change as well. When you're talking about global distribution of your application, but more importantly, employees, then you have to be async first when it comes to communication. You have to provide a way for other people that aren't in the room or in the Slack at that moment in time to be able to share information, to share decisions, to share thoughts with people. So your communication model changes. It should be async first. You should probably write down far too much rather than writing down too little. And stick to public channels. If you're thinking, I'm just going to DM this person and ask a question, or we're going to talk about something, by moving that to a public channel, you allow people to consume that information on their own time as well. And we're lucky at Influx Data. We are a remote first company. I think 55 to 60% of the company is distributed outside of San Francisco. So, we're struggling with communication, but we're getting better every week. So async and public communications are key.
All right. Excellent. Well, we're getting up there in time. So I'm going to put this slide up, Global DevOps Deep Thoughts. And this is basically just kind of maybe any last thoughts that folks have, our panelists have today on global DevOps. One of the things that we actually didn't go over, so I wanted to throw it out there to you guys. Very briefly, idea or the issue of compliance was mentioned. And so I'm wondering, do you guys see compliance issues, especially as it pertains to meeting compliance, new compliance issues as they come down, or new compliance regulations as they come down the pike for each individual company or country? Do you guys see that as being an issue with global DevOps? If you've got an application that has, is running in multiple countries, but each country has a different, set of compliance regulations, is that an issue?
Yes, it is all over the place. So you can't take workloads that are out of like somewhere in the EU and bring them over into the United States. You have to segment them and keep them over there. For example, Azure in Germany is quite a bit different than it is elsewhere.
What about the applications themselves that companies are creating?
For the applications themselves, you have to handle the way in which you deal with the data. So like for an application that produces logs, what are you actually putting into those logs? For an application that loads data, maybe taking a particular piece of the request as input, how do you manage and track who accesses what? For example, there's something called insecure direct object reference, whereby somebody can just enumerate through all the values and pull all of your records. Obviously, you shouldn't have that really anywhere, but especially in the regulated areas. So I just see a real need to both assess and protect applications from a security standpoint, like figuring out what particular vulnerabilities are in both the custom code as well as a lot of the open source components, which White Source does a great job of covering.
All right. Great. Anybody else have any compliance thoughts, deep thoughts?
I think there's a couple of extra challenges involved. Using GDPR as the prime example again, we as a European customer, whenever I go to a website, I'll get a banner that tells me it's going to store a cookie, and those cookies under GDPR have to be opt-in. But what I find is when I go onto a VPN, sometimes US sites, or if I go through a US VPN to the same site, I may find that disclaimer is actually opt-out. And it's all these kind of little application tweaks that people are making in order to, I don't know if it's to trick non-GDPR applied people or not, but that just adds complexity to your code. That's probably not worth it in the long term. And of course, with EU data not being allowed to leave the EU, if you want to run any batch processing, or if you want to use Splunk for machine learning of your logs, or you want to understand your system as a whole, those aggregations become extremely complicated as well. If everything's in Europe, that might be easier, but then as other regulations apply around the world, trying to aggregate that, you have to anonymize the data and ship it, and that's obviously expensive as well, especially going in and out of AWS. And so it's definitely tricky.
Yeah, because you pay that data egress cost.
Yeah, and.
All right. Anybody else?
One more thing is just in the context of what we have for software and things moving at the speed of DevOps, we have software-defined networks, we have software-defined virtual machines, we even have software-defined radio. So I think we can have some good work if we get software-designed security of applications defending themselves. So the technology, just like it does for virtual machines and networks, it works quite well when you let it.
Excellent. All right. So we have about 12 minutes to the top of the hour. I just want to give you guys a chance to talk about anything that we have not talked about so far with global DevOps before we move into the question and answer period. So does anybody have anything, final thoughts here that they want to share with us?
No, I guess just to emphasize that it's all about having the right processes and the right automation in place. I think that if we speak about the security aspect, so it's definitely a challenge, but it's not something to hold you from moving to DevOps or to global DevOps. There are solutions out there, so you just have to go and find them.
Okay. Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I also think that, to Eric's point about applications being able to protect themselves, I think that's very valid as we're going to scale. I don't think we can rely on having enough security people to be looking after these applications, right? So we have to get clever about how we do these things, how we do security at this global scale. We need to either use clever technologies, or we need to think about how do we enable and shift some of that workload to developers and enable the developers to do a better job of writing secure code in the first place.
Okay, great. David or Eric, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to agree with what Eric and then Colin has reaffirmed there, that we do have software-defined networks, software-defined infrastructure, and now software-defined security, I think, will be a huge player in the next few years. If we look at like SecComp or eBPF, these are really interesting tools, but unless you're a Linux kernel developer, maybe really difficult to get started, really difficult to understand how to put the ruling and the tooling together and how to build the tracing and alerting. And I think over the next few years, we'll actually see this get a lot easier, and we will be able to build those hooks into our applications as well as our infrastructure. So I'm very excited for that software-defined security space.
Yeah, David, just for some interest in terms of the way that we do that for contrast, we hook in with Java applications through something called the instrumentation API. So there's basically no code changes. All of them, .NET has it also, so do Python, Node, and a number of the managed runtimes. So you really just get the ability to put things into the methods basically the same way that New Relic and App Dynamics work, so that you don't need to be a super performance tester to get your metrics out. You don't need to be a super security expert to get your details. So we kind of take that security knowledge down from the priesthood of cybersecurity and make it available to everyone to just do, whether they know it or not.
All right. Cool. Well, we have about 9 minutes to the top of the hour. We have time for a couple questions, but we have gotten so many questions in, guys. And I do want to let the audience know that if we don't get to your question, please know that all of our panelists will be getting a copy of the question. So I'm sure somebody from their organization will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Let's go ahead and dive in. Maybe we can get to 2 or 3 of them here. Let's see. So I understand taking the world, DevOps taking the world, geographically speaking, but what about DevOps being ubiquitous from mainframe to mobile? Any comments there? You guys have any thoughts on that? It's kind of a different way of thinking for sure.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with a lot of people that do DevOps on a mainframe. But for everything else, like for applications, it's just the ability to rapidly deploy, rapidly iterate. So for mobile, I know the guys over at Gluon that get Java running on mobile phones, the actual JRE. There's a lot of things that you can do to just rapidly deploy in app stores with continuous releases. So that I think is common. Mainframes, I don't see as much of that, but maybe.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point to the mainframe topic is mainframes, typically big banks and that will use mainframes as a system of record, right? And these things are designed by their nature not to change, right? They audited and secured and their behavior is understood, and they don't change that frequently. So they probably don't really suit the fast-moving and innovative aspect of, I can't remember, this is type 1 or type 2, I can't remember what they, the one is a system of record, the other is a system of innovation. DevOps lends itself to transforming systems of innovation. So I don't think it's necessarily relevant on the mainframe side, certainly mobile, absolutely no reason why DevOps shouldn't become ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think if you search GitHub for COBOL, you'll get the first error 404.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, let's see. The next question here is, so we had a question about compliance, which we've pretty much gone over with, but he's asking about compliance, particularly in regard to security and privacy of data. So I'm not sure that we actually went over privacy of data too much. So do you guys have any thoughts on what are some of the considerations there when we're talking about compliance and privacy of data specifically?
Yeah, I think it relates more to what type of data you store and where you store it. So like you want to make sure that any data that you store is in the same region that the application operates. So your German data stays in Germany, your Chinese data stays in China. you keep things together, and you want to make sure that when your application produces log statements, that you don't do things like logging passwords or credit card numbers to that data that might be visible to other people. So like the ability to mask sensitive data for logs is important, because somebody's going to look at those logs, and if they get all the passwords or credit cards, doesn't seem so good for you.
Anybody else want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think the point about the data, and it comes down to the regions. I mean, I've worked on a global scale with a big consultancy group doing global deployments. They really had to think about how they were going to partition their regions, and this really meant, depending on how the different parts of their company were governed, you really have to follow the mapping of the organization to understand what those regional boundaries look like. I think cloud technologies, if implemented correctly, suit themselves pretty well to being able to encapsulate and kind of isolate the data between regions using directory control, Active Directories and the like. But you have to be thinking about what is your organizational model and what do your requirements look like, rather than letting the techie people, work this out for themselves.
All right. All right, great. All right, well, we're about 5 minutes at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period here, but I do want to thank everybody who did submit a question. And as I said before, if we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but hopefully somebody from the panelist organizations will be happy to follow up with you offline and get the answer that you're looking for. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of today's webinar, or if you just want to watch it and listen to it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out a link after today's webinar that includes we'll be sending out an email after today's webinar that includes a link to access the webinar on demand. In that email will also be a link to download to the ebook that today's presentation has been based on. So take a look out for there. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So you can always go check it out there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars and look in the on-demand section, and it will be right there waiting for you. Colin, Shuri, Eric, and David, thank you all so much for being my esteemed panelists today and having such a great discussion. I really do appreciate the time you took.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
All right, great. Thank you very much again. And I want to thank the audience also for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.